With the recent Michael movie, everyone is debating Joe Jackson as a father. But today I want to talk about something that we are absolutely overlooking, and that is Katherine Jackson as a mother and what her power and soft strength meant to her family, her children, and even the people around her. Stay tuned. We're going to dig in. Welcome to the Secret Formula of Femininity for women who want to live a more feminine, fun, and fabulous life. I'm Dr. Nicole Monteiro, your host on this weekly journey to unlocking your inner radiance, nurturing fulfilling relationships, and becoming the best version of yourself. Welcome back to the Secret Formula of Femininity. I am your host and guide on this journey to tapping into your feminine essence, Dr. Nicole. With the viral Michael film that even if you haven't seen it, I'm sure you have heard about it. There's been so much renewed interest and conversation about the Jackson family. A lot of people did not know a lot about Michael Jackson's family dynamic and upbringing, and so there's this renewed interest. And people are revisiting the story and the legacy and the impact of not just Michael Jackson, but the family and looking at the parenting and the family structure. And I find this so fascinating and interesting, and I'm so glad we're able to have a deeper conversation about it. And as expected, most of the conversation centers from the family perspective on Joe Jackson, the way he disciplined, his methods, his role as a father. But as I continue to hear people debate and hear the conversations happening, I found myself really thinking about someone else, someone whose impact you could say was a quiet impact, but it was very substantial and very strong, was Katherine Jackson. And she's actually 96 years old today. Joe Jackson has passed on. We know Michael Jackson has passed on. One of his older brothers has passed on. But I want us to really look at Katherine Jackson. She's someone that I believe deserves her flowers. But I also want us to talk about her in a nuanced way because we tend to talk about figures that are, their legacy, but we don't always humanize them. We don't always really look at the context that they had to make decisions and choices within. So we either put them on a pedestal and idealize them, or on the other hand, we villainize them without really seeing them as human. And so I really want us to shift this conversation, not even to debate or to defend anyone, but to really expand how we understand women, how we understand femininity and motherhood, especially in difficult environments. And that is the environmental context of the early Jackson family life. Some women weren't passive, they were actually navigating survival. So we really need to understand that. Before we talk about Catherine, we have to understand the environment because no family exists in isolation. I don't care what you think about the family values, the decisions they made, the resources they had or didn't have. We have to understand the environmental context. So, first, let's talk about Joe because he's the one who's such a prominent figure in these debates. Just to give some clear context for those who may not be familiar, Joseph Jackson, grew up in the Jim Crow South. This was an environment that I need you to understand. It was defined by racism, economic hardship, being dehumanized and degraded as a man, and also for women, having very limited opportunities, systemic oppression. And then he moved to Indiana. And this was an experience that many Black families during the Great Migration can relate to. They left what felt like oppressive conditions, lack of opportunity in the Jim Crow South to go north for more economic opportunity. And actually, this is something that is within my own family background. My great grandmother, maternal grandmother, left Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas, and went to Chicago. Many families left from the South to chase or to find economic opportunity. And so I also want to give an aside. That's also important as we think about migration these days. People usually don't just up and leave where they are unless they really desperately need and want something different and better for themselves and for their families. So, going up north to Indiana, Joe Jackson still faced these oppressive circumstances. He faced discrimination, poverty, pressures to survive. He was working in a steel mill under very difficult conditions, often night shift. And again, understanding context is not the same as excusing behavior because a lot of people are focused on the way he parented. But I want to tell you that so much of what we don't accept now was actually very common and very acceptable back then. And a lot of the physically abusive behaviors that we can critique and criticize and really distance ourselves from now are actually behaviors that were learned on slave plantations. I know you guys didn't expect me to get into history like that now, but I just need you to understand that there was so much about the way men and women behaved that was inherited dysfunction. And so I've been on the record in many, phases of my career talking about how I do not condone corporal punishment, especially aggressive, harsh verbal abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and so forth. But even the parts where Joe is reported to have told Michael he had a big nose and maybe said it to some of his other kids, those were inherited, internalized racism behaviors. During slavery and Jim Crow, people of African descent were ostracized and criticized and berated for looking like they were of African descent, for their hair texture, their skin color, their features. So, this is what we call internalized self hatred when you actually criticize somebody for having features that actually represent you. So that context is important. And again, it's not excusing behavior. We can actually hold both truths. Harm can exist, and the context within which it developed is important as well. It matters. Although survival environments don't excuse everything that people do, they certainly shape how people see the world and how they behave. Now, let's talk about where Katherine Jackson sits in this story. I really admire Catherine for so many reasons. But historically, women like her are often labeled in very simplistic ways: quiet, submissive, passive, but that is rarely the full story. And actually, I've been seeing various posts go around on social media calling her weak, dumb, how could she? She's just as abusive, she's horrible. But we need to understand and reframe Catherine's experience. She existed in a patriarchal structure, very firm and strict boundaries around male and female gender roles and expectations. There was also economic pressure within which she existed, cultural expectations, and limited options. But yet, within all of those confines, she thrived and she had such an important role and impact on her family. If you hear not just Michael Jackson talk about her, but all of the siblings, the way they talk about her, it tells you the impact that she had. Softness doesn't always mean freedom. Sometimes it exists within constraint, but it still flourishes nonetheless. What Catherine represented appears to have brought emotional grounding for her children, a nurturing presence for her family, spiritual stability. One thing you hear of her talk about a lot is her faith, and that trickled down to her family. Consistency within the family. And in families like the Jackson family, especially as they continue to rise to fame, that role is not at all small. In fact, it's foundational and it's central. It's not just something as a happenstance, it is the core to how they were able to develop. In many families, the feminine energy is what holds the emotional world of all of its members together. And this is something that I've been trying to convey. So I love the fact that we get to look at Catherine as an example of what that looked like. Now, I need us to also really think about the multifaceted nature of femininity. And that's just a fancy way to say, hey, femininity is not a one note song. One of the biggest misconceptions is that femininity is one thing, that it looks one way, but it is absolutely layered. It can be soft and strong, and often is, quiet and influential, highly influential, sometimes because of that soft quietness, enduring and powerful. A lot of times, what people see as passive is actually a strategy, it's actually a sign of resilience and thinking about the long term in the big picture. We can assume that Catherine's likely role is that she may not have been the visible authority, but she may have been the emotional regulator for her family, for her children, the safe place, and the stabilizer. If you look at the various interviews and various stories about the Jackson family, of course, we don't know them, but they were very much enamored and appreciative of her emotional presence in their life. And that says a lot. Not all strength is loud. Some of it is quiet, consistent, but yet still deeply impactful. And an important thing that I need us to reframe is that softness is weakness. It's often misunderstood as weakness. So it's just like if you're soft, you're weak. But softness can be restraint, patience, emotional intelligence, and the ability to endure for the bigger picture. Now, the word endurance can also be triggering. I've heard women say, why? I'm sick of it. Why do we have to endure all of this abuse and so forth? But if we look at the word endurance, it's often used interchangeably with the word stamina. But we all know that in life, stamina, in order to be successful, is required. Resilience is an important quality to have in order to get through life. So sometimes the most quiet seeming, the most passive people, but sometimes the most passive or quiet seeming people have the most inner resilience and the ability to have stamina to get through life's hardships. It's absolutely a fact that those things are required. And if you look at the conditions within which Catherine was operating in, you can see how endurance absolutely was an important quality. Also, just to backtrack, I read that she contracted polio as a small girl at 2 years old. And so, for the rest of her life, up until now, she walks with a slight limp. But yet, that wasn't something that stopped her in life. She was very fond of music. I think she was in band and played clarinet as a teenager. She went on to meet Joe Jackson. They got married, they bought a house. 2300 Jackson Street, I know because there was a song about it that the Jackson siblings later sang about. And she created costumes for her kids as they continued to get famous and go out and perform. She comforted her kids, and I would assume she provided a level of balance in that household where Joe Jackson was driven and performance based, and he disciplined in a way that we may not agree with, but I would say it's a way that he knew how. Now we know better, so we do better. And again, not every parent did that during his day and time, but many did. But she, if we think about Katherine Jackson, she created such a balance and so much emotional and psychological grounding for her children that it shows when they talk about her, when they remember their mom, the way they honor her. And Michael was especially close to her. One thing I've noticed is that softness is often the strength that doesn't get credit because it's not disruptive or not seen as disruptive, but it is vitally important. Now, let's look at the dynamic, the male female dynamic that existed between Joe and Catherine. Joe's approach certainly was discipline, structure, pressure, performance. It was rooted in, I need to get my family out of this situation. We are going to do it by hook and crook. I don't care. Whatever the casualties are, I don't care. We have one mission. Catherine's approach was nurturing emotional presence, relational connection, emotional intelligence. And you can see it in the way that her children communicate. And one thing I really liked is the movie portrayed the deep bond between Michael in his mother and the way that she truly understood him. And it wasn't shown in the movie, but just from other accounts, the way she really understood each of her children. Now, there is a tension between these two approaches, between Joe's drivenness and her softness. This creates, in some ways, a dual system, the focus on physical provision versus emotional safety, on survival versus connection. And we know now more than ever that children just don't need provision, they need emotional safety. And we also know that there's a cost when survival is the priority. In those cases, emotional needs often get deprioritized, not because they don't matter, but because they don't feel urgent in the moment. So, despite all of the other things happening, Catherine was a steady source of helping to prioritize connection, relationship, and her children's emotional needs. Now, this is where we need to make sure that we're being mature in our thinking. Two things can be true. This is one of my favorite sayings because it's really true about life. Joe's actions may have caused harm, and he was shaped by a survival environment. Catherine may have stayed, and she may have been doing the best she could within her reality. Because I hear a lot of people saying, well, why I wouldn't have stayed. You absolutely don't know. We can acknowledge harm while still seeing humanity. This matters because when we oversimplify people, we miss the deeper lessons, not just in understanding them, but the deeper lessons that we can take and apply to our own life. I want you to think about this, the women in your life, your mother, your grandmother, and ask yourself, what kind of strength did they carry? What did they endure quietly? What did they hold together emotionally despite the hardships within their environment? Some women weren't given choices, they were given responsibilities, and they did the best that they could. So I went through my inbox and took some questions that people sent me that I think relate to this topic. So let's go through them. Question one is, does softness mean staying in difficult situations? Well, not necessarily. Softness is not about staying or going. It's about how you relate to yourself and others and how you create a sense of freedom and autonomy, even within situations that feel constraining to you. Sometimes you can't change your outer environment, but you can change your internal experience. The second question is staying always weakness? No, it's not. Sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's generational, and sometimes it's situational. It's hard to go back and judge people in the past when you don't know the full context of the choices that they had. What you can do, though, is look at your own life and the choices that you have now. And you can take, as the saying goes, take the meat and spit out the bones of things that you've seen with women in prior generations. There's a level of endurance and sacrifice that I think we can learn from women who have fewer choices than what we have today. Because quite honestly, sometimes it is so easy for us to give up, walk away, cut off, cancel, and we have lost the ability of having that inner resilience or applying it to relationships within our lives. The third question is, what does healthy femininity look like today? I love that one. It includes softness and boundaries, emphasis on the boundaries part, compassion and self protection, presence and agency. So now we have the options to keep that core softness that we saw women like Catherine exhibit, but we also have more options and choices. We can have the boundaries, we can communicate them, we can have emotional self protection as we become more self aware. We have more agency, meaning more options and choices that we can make for our own lives. The bottom line is femininity today is very nuanced, but it's also very empowering. If there's one thing I want you to take from this episode, this discussion, it's this: femininity is not one dimensional. I just said that, right? And neither are women. Some women didn't lack strength, they carried it in ways the world did not always acknowledge or recognize, but it was deeply impactful nonetheless. If you're exploring your own relationship with femininity, strength, and identity, this is exactly the work we do within my inner circle, the Boundaries to Bliss Society. In my inner circle, women are learning how to embody softness without losing themselves, how to create emotional safety, how to redefine strength in a way that actually supports the life that they want for themselves. You can learn more about the Boundaries to Bliss Society at the link in the show notes. And as always, make sure you subscribe, follow, give us a like, leave us a review on the podcast platforms. It really matters. And share this with a woman who you know is rethinking what it means to be soft and what it means to be strong. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I hope this discussion sparked some thought within you. Leave a comment and let me know what about Catherine's story resonated with you. I'll see you in the next episode. And until then, stay soft, stay strong, and stay feminine. I'm Dr. Nicole.